Olá pessoal, sejam bem-vindos ao BDR Day. Meu nome é João Lisboa, sou sócio da IP, faço parte da equipe há 7 anos e hoje a gente vai falar sobre carros elétricos e carros autônomos. Eu estou aqui com um convidado especial, é o Edward Niedermeyer. O Edward é um parceiro nosso há já alguns anos que a gente se conhece. Ele é autor de um livro sobre a Tesla chamado Ludicrous, onde ele fez uma pesquisa investigativa sobre a empresa e desvendou várias descobertas no processo produtivo dela, que ele vai falar com a gente hoje. E o Edward também é diretor de uma empresa chamada PAVE, é uma non-profit que ajuda a fazer educação sobre carros autônomos para a indústria nos Estados Unidos. O Edward é americano, então a gente vai conduzir essa entrevista em inglês. Eu vou trocar aqui para inglês agora, mas vamos começar a entrevista. Edward, thanks for being here, man. I've just made a brief presentation of you in Portuguese. We've known each other for like 3 years now, since we had our trip. So Edward and I, we went together on a trip visiting car factories around the world. So we've been to 9 car factories in the US, in Japan, in China, and countries in Europe, Germany, UK. And during the trip, Ed's an industry specialist. He's been in the industry for more than a decade now. And Ed taught us so much about the industry and the manufacturing process and the issues and the problems. And Ed is super into the transition that's happening in the industry from traditional internal combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles and then autonomous vehicles. So like his specialty today is autonomous vehicles, but we'll go through the entire industry perspective and talk a little about that. So Ed, welcome to BDR Day.
Thanks so much for having me. It's so good to see you again, Joe.
Great, Ed. Well, maybe we could start by the basics of the industry. So we're seeing electric vehicles taking space in the industry more and more. So like it's been a rapid growth and adoption, at least in the margin of cars being sold. Why is that happening? Why is it happening so fast? And is it inevitable or not?
So I think, to some extent, I think there's a strong argument to be made that sort of the move towards electrification is inevitable for a couple of reasons. One, internal combustion technology simply, I think the progress that's been made in internal combustion is widely underappreciated. But I think it's also quite clear, and that progress continues, but we're getting to sort of diminishing returns on that technology, and electrification is just very clearly where things go next. I think in the big picture, there's sort of a long-term trend you can see in a bunch of different technologies, sort of moving from more mechanical systems to more sort of moving electrons instead of moving atoms, and I think that electrification is certainly part of that. But you can say electrification is inevitable, but within that, there's a rich spectrum of different expressions of that inevitability, and that ranges from sort of who is buying those electric cars, which varies a lot market to market, why they're buying those cars, which varies a lot market to market, and even just sort of the form that electrification takes. Is it pure battery electric? Is it hybrid? Is it plug-in hybrid? Is it hydrogen? So there's a lot of diversity to sort of encompass when you talk about this sort of big picture trend, especially because these different aspects are different from place to place. And I think that sort of highlights what to me seems to be the sort of most central factor in this transition so far, and that's government policy. Governments and auto industries have long been quite closely joined, have often worked in concert together. They're often national champions in the auto industry, and and the government's policy goals are oftentimes sort of reflected in what happens in the market through regulations of various kinds. And so I think certainly the giant leap in Europe is very clearly tied to their carbon emission reduction goals. China's emergence as a major both industrial player and also huge market for electric vehicles is very clearly a part of a lot of different Chinese government goals. And in the U.S., where this transition has been a little bit more has been a little bit different than it has been elsewhere, also reflects, I think, sort of the state of politics and regulation. So I think that if you have to sort of boil all this down to one sort of key factor, I would say sort of government regulation policy is really sort of at the heart of a lot of it.
Perfect. Well, you talk about Europe and then China and the US, and each region having its particular legislation. So the regulations that are pushing these the electric vehicles forward. And I'd love to hear what are the differences between these regions and the regulations that are being applied in each region.
Yeah, so rather than answer that by going into the details of the regulations themselves, which are quite arcane and frankly, I'm not versed in all of those details. I think it's interesting to see how it's been sort of expressed, right, in the market. And so, for example, in the U.S., we have very, very little regulation that pushes battery EVs or zero emission vehicles, even in particular. The state of California does have, a set of rules that do encourage zero emission vehicles, and I think it's no coincidence that is where we've seen sort of the electric vehicle industry start to take root in the United States. For the first time. The auto industry traditionally does not operate much in California, but as a result of that as well, the market in the U.S. is very much a premium market. I won't say luxury necessarily, but it's still very much a premium market. There's been a lot of talk about more affordable EVs, but frankly, what we're really seeing where the action is both in the market today and with the products that are coming into the market is sort of bigger, larger, heavier vehicles, sort of what you think of as more like traditional American vehicles in a lot of ways that just happen to be battery electric. And you can talk about, big premium sedans like Tesla and Lucid. You can talk about, crossovers, but also bigger trucks like Rivian, the forthcoming Hummer EV and things like that. As you look at China, China's focus on this is arguably as much or more on the sort of industrial side than it is on the market side. And of course, the market is just very different. Although it's interesting, China does have, a vast and growing number of super high net worth individuals, but you don't see that sort of premium electric car market developing there quite as much. What you see more is, sort of the middle class and even sort of much more affordable electric vehicles. And again, a lot of that is tied to local regional incentives, oftentimes tied to, encouraging local factories and local manufacturers, oftentimes tied to, the operation of ride hailing fleets and things of that nature. So in China, you have a much more sort of mass market, affordable type of EV market, which really stands in sharp contrast to the US, where, vehicles like the Nissan Leaf, have really signally failed. Even the Chevrolet Bolt is, well received car, but just did not have sort of the kind of runaway success that you've seen from the more premium offerings from, for example, Tesla. And Europe is a little bit of a blend between the two. Europe is, it's a little bit more of a, kind of replacing that sort of middle class Volkswagen Golf type of vehicle. There's more of the premium market there as well. You see at the high end more taste for these battery EVs as kind of a status symbol, like you see in California and other parts of the U.S. And other parts of the world as well, by the way. But what's interesting too in Europe is that despite those rules, the standards, the emission standards being sharply ramped up, you still also have companies like Toyota. Which I think, especially at a time with all this sort of froth and excitement, Toyota is always a very interesting sort of pragmatic baseline to compare the rest of the industry to. And they're managing to meet those higher standards in Europe with mostly just hybrid vehicles by simply, having some limited electrification in all their cars rather than sort of keeping some cars the way they've been and making some cars pure battery electric. So that's kind of what I mean by these sorts of various approaches. Even in Europe, which again has been sort of one of the places where the standards have ramped up the toughest in the shortest amount of time, and where we've seen the most sort of growth in battery electric EVs. Toyota's out there proving you don't necessarily need to even have a pure BEV fleet by any stretch, or even a lot of BEVs to meet those standards. And so I think that suggests that hybrid is or has been a viable strategy for a while. As those standards ramp up, though, that may be more of a challenge, and you see now Toyota also getting more and more into the battery electric vehicles.
Makes perfect sense, Ed. And one thing that's related to the price and to the cost that is required to reach battery vehicles or even hybrid vehicles, as you're talking, it seems to be incentive dependent. So it seems not to be economically viable yet without the incentives from the governments. But the cost is declining, has been declining rapidly over the last years. And how far do you think we are from a real economically viable battery or hybrid vehicle without incentives?
So I think for hybrid, I think for Toyota, my understanding is they're pretty close to cost parity between hybrid and non-hybrid, which is why in a place like Europe where the standards require it, basically every vehicle you can buy from them is a hybrid, and so that's certainly encouraging. In terms of battery electric vehicles, the cost parity question is an interesting one, in part because the traditionally sort of managing the supply chain costs, was a very specific set of skills, and it was all sort of around machining and tooling and certain kinds of well-known raw materials and things like that. We have a really interesting situation now where there's this sort of push-pull between the market and the incentives that are driving the market on the one hand, and just sort of the supply chain for battery materials on the other, and that relationship does not seem to be a very mature one, right? You think when you have sort of a mature relationship between supply and demand, you have things stay fairly close to an equilibrium at all times, and we see, in fact, the battery materials market is quite volatile, and that suggests that and we see all kinds of drama around companies trying to make these big deals to secure these long-term supplies, but they're having to do that in the face of real questions about how these markets are going to continue to evolve, especially, I would say, especially in places like the United States, where the sort of political and regulatory environment that is so critical to all this is so uncertain in a lot of senses. And so, I think it's a very new challenge. And I think that getting to real sort of mass scale, which is always in the auto industry the key to getting costs down, is going to be quite tricky. It's going to take time. And I don't know if more vertical integration is going to be part of that. But I think, one of the sort of X factors in all this is that sort of, I mentioned China's interest in EVs is not just in terms of developing a domestic market, but it's also strategically in terms of dominating the supply chain. And I think, there may come a time when some countries may look at China's, undoubted domination of the EV supply chain and say, this is something that strategically we can't really tolerate, and we're going to have to, whether it's entirely economical in the short run or not, invest in our own, for strategic reasons, our own sort of battery supply chain. And by the way, some of that may come in sort of unconventional forms. It may not just be mining and resource extraction, but I think there's some really exciting things happening with, for example, Redwood Materials, which is founded by former Tesla co-founder J.B. Straubel, and his vision for sort of turning recycled materials into this sort of closed loop supply chain, and potentially being able to take all of the lithium-ion batteries that are out there in so many devices, not just cars, and recycling them and making that a really viable source for these raw feedstocks, which in turn could then feed a sort of more independent battery supply chain. So I think things like that could really jumpstart scale, because the incentive will be there for not purely like short-term economic reasons, and something like that could be a game changer, frankly, or even just sort of variations of that idea. Again, with the U.S., I think it's an interesting situation that sort of a lot of these new mobility technologies are so dependent on government policy and regulatory policy, and yet we have so many questions about sort of government's ability and the ability to build political consensus even, and things of that nature. So I think that's those political factors are not something that I think auto industry analysts are typically used to looking at, but I think they're well worth keeping a close eye on in these circumstances.
Sure, perfect. Well, you talked a lot about supply chain and how you need to scale the battery production in order to make it cost effective. And but electric vehicles, I believe they have a supply chain that's pretty different from the traditional supply chain of parts from the internal combustion engines we're used to. How would you describe the main differences besides the battery supply chain that will change in the industry, that will impact the whole chain of automobiles?
Yeah, well, we're seeing a little piece of that future in the news right now, right? Where there's all this talk about car factories not being able to produce because of supply chain shortages. And what are those shortages in? It's not the traditional, kinds of car parts that you think of as being the bread and butter for the automotive supply chain. It is chips, and I think in addition to chips, there's a number of sort of electronic components. You think about the power control electronics, the silicon carbide. There's all kinds of sort of new and frankly, the new ones are coming up all the time. A decade ago, before Tesla, no one talked about silicon carbide. Now it's something. GM just announced a big sort of long-term deal to secure supplies of those power electronic components. So I think we're seeing a shift away, and essentially what's happening is that the huge amount of value that was sort of aggregated in a drivetrain, which is made up of lots and lots and lots of little pieces and requires this big, diverse supply chain. The value is so concentrated in the battery, and then beyond that, you also have these sort of electronic components and power control components, where the issue is less that there needs to be so many of them, and more that these are components that are also in demand from other industries, which is also something that the auto industry is not particularly used to sharing its supply chain with other industries. And that's a big part of the chip problem right now, right? Is that these components are in demand, and everything from video game consoles to, toothbrushes or whatever, these chips are in everything now. So we are in a very new world. And it's one in which the auto industry can no longer, I think, dominate its suppliers. Well, either it has to pick one or the other. Either they have to vertically integrate and be very certain that you're going to use, enough of these components that you can justify making that kind of investment, or you need to be, very flexible and willing to work with a lot of different people. But in any case, this whole concept of just having to share the critical components of the supply chain with other industries. This is a whole new world for autos, and it's going to take a while to adjust to that.
This is a super interesting point, Ed. So like how this value and strength in the chain moves as you move from a traditional industry for a more, let's say, a more technological industry, and then you have all these new components and everything that's going on, and how this is super complex and it will require new modes for these businesses. And but let's just move to the big elephant in the room here. So it's Tesla. So you've written a book about Tesla. You've been following the company for what, a decade now, or maybe more than that?
Yeah, more or less. Yeah, getting close to that. Yeah.
Yeah, and well, you know the company well better than maybe most of the people on the planet, and you've been following everything that's happening from the beginning, from the time they were struggling with cash, from their first models, for the evolution to more affordable models, and then you've followed the whole story of the company, and the company. It seems like there are two Teslas, right? So the Tesla that everyone sees, which is the media hype that says, "Hey, Tesla is perfect. It's the future. It is the whole new level of a car." And then there's Tesla, the on the ground company that the employees and the people that were involved with the company see, and it's a company that has very like many merits and many challenges. And that has had to deal with them over all these years. How would you evaluate Tesla from everything that you've seen? So like, what are Tesla's real strengths behind the hype? And what are Tesla's weaknesses that maybe isn't clear for everyone?
Yeah. Well, I think the most important thing to remember with Tesla is that, especially because it's such a polarized discourse, I think that it's important to think about why is it worth paying attention to this company? And for me, it really is to sort of just understand this is a company that is undoubtedly at the cutting edge. We culturally have come to see that term, the cutting edge, being on the cutting edge, as an intrinsically good thing, or an intrinsically positive thing. And obviously, there are clear advantages to being on the technological cutting edge. But I think we oftentimes forget that it's actually a mixed blessing being on the cutting edge. And I think it's also really important to understand why cars traditionally have not been on the cutting edge, and that's because the cutting edge is fundamentally one of unreliability, right? If you are adopting the newest, the latest, the technologies with the most potential, these are by definition the technologies or the practices that are also the least validated. And the auto industry has been built around validation, has earned a reputation for sort of slow-paced, methodical movements for real reasons. And I think that part of what gets lost in the whole Tesla thing is that this company comes across as new and different for very specific reasons. And so in the book that I wrote, it's oftentimes interpreted as an attempt to kick dirt on Tesla or whatever. That's really not my intention at all. I think it is really important to look at this company and say, okay, this is a company that's taking a whole new attitude to the auto industry, right? It's taking a Silicon Valley startup style culture and applying it to the auto industry. What are the strengths of that approach, right? And for the most part, a lot of those strengths are very obvious to everyone, and that's why Tesla is this phenomenon that you see today. It's the strengths of this new attitude are visible to a consumer, recognizable to a consumer, which is great. And that's an important asset to have, and surprising and delighting consumers. And I'm talking about here about everything from, the big screen to the, over there updates to, all of the things that everyone talks about at Tesla. And this is, people also, they accuse me of being negative about Tesla. I think oftentimes it's not worth repeating the things that are so positive about it, because everyone kind of knows about it. And I think the really interesting stuff is the stuff that people don't understand so well. And for example, with the screen, that Tesla Model S in 2012 came out with this giant 17-inch screen or something close to it, 15-inch screen, and everyone said, wow, this is amazing that this company must have technology beyond anybody else to have this. And in reality, what had happened was they'd simply picked a screen that wasn't automotive grade. There was no automotive grade screen, and the auto industry has very consciously created these standards of robustness and reliability, because at the end of the day, we all may want a car that's on the cutting edge, but like that, we only want that to the extent that it actually works. Like we want it to be on the cutting edge, but still validated and still tested, and that we know it will work in our weather and on our streets, and that will hold up for the amount of time that we expect a car to hold up, and to the kind of abuse that cars have to hold up to. And so I think, with Tesla, you can see very clearly that, okay, so they have this screen, it creates this perception of technological superiority, but really what it was risk tolerance on their part. They were willing to say, well, maybe this will fail more than other screens, but it's bigger. And they made a calculated gamble there. And I think that they made consistent choices like that, sort of favoring that short-term surprise and delight impression, especially stuff that consumers and just kind of typical people, or at least people who are like into high tech, stuff, can kind of grasp and understand. And sort of what they gave up in all that is all the stuff that the public never really thinks about, which is the stuff that the auto industry spends all day thinking about. Like, how easy is this to manufacture? How reliably can we get this manufacturing down? How efficiently can we manufacture it? And then, how robust is it? What all will it hold up to? Spending year plus, sometimes 2 years, multiple years, just testing, just to make sure the car works in the desert, in the jungle, and you can argue maybe for some consumers that was too much, and that was a legacy way of thinking that was just sort of taken for granted and wasn't being challenged. I do think in the long run, Tesla has shown that you have to bring some of this new thinking to cars, but I think that also, it's really, there's some risk bombs that it's allowed to kind of put out there that I think are ticking. In some cases, the ticking is getting louder and louder. In some cases, they're not necessarily bombs that will just blow up and cause sort of major damage. They're more things that will just sort of slowly sap that customer appeal. And I think that service and just reliability combined, those two have not been priorities, and that is definitely something that is already, I think, driving a lot of the interest in some of the alternatives to Tesla, like Rivian and Lucid and what have you. So yeah, so I think yeah, there's a lot of positive, there's a lot of challenges, let's call them. But I think the important thing to remember is that the positives have really been front loaded, and that the challenges, in some cases, Tesla does, when it gets its back up against the wall, nobody else has the ability to dig out of like a crazy hole like Tesla's people do. But I think that you can only survive on heroics for so long in the car business. At some point, you need to be able to think about getting to a steady operating state, a sustainable place. And I just haven't seen Tesla even try to really get there and consolidate so much. So I think there's still a lot more risk around the company than people realize.
Perfect. I remember from your book, so you mentioned that Tesla had that secret master plan, which was like, hey, let's put out something really expensive, good looking and performant, and then we'll use the profits from that to fund something mid-level, still a little bit expensive, but not that restrictive, and then we'll get the profits from that, and we're going down towards more affordable cars. And that during the whole process, it wasn't even able to manage like profits from the upper levels to finance that. So it was just keep selling the dream forward and forward. And then one comparison that really struck with me was that when you mentioned like when you're at the frontier, you're allowed to be unreliable as long as you have that wow factor. So like Ferrari, I believe in your book you mentioned Ferrari as the example, right? So Ferrari has always had the wow factor, yeah, and not that reliable, and you keep having these problems. But like I believe the reliability problem, it begins to be a bigger issue as you go down the master plan. Like so as you go towards more and more affordable vehicles, and and that gets us to where we are now. So Tesla's got the Model 3, which is it's more affordable vehicle on the plan. It is planning to expand in volumes and to get cars into more and more people's hands. But at the same time, you have the reliable automakers coming with their own electric vehicle alternatives. So you've mentioned Toyota with their hybrids, and we've got other competitors there, and they're racing to close the gap with Tesla in terms of features and in terms of how they can get electric vehicles in people's hands. So how do you see this competitive scenario for Tesla? So who's competing with them, and how do their cars compare with the first mover that was Tesla?
Yeah, so I mean, I think you kind of have to look at it market by market a little bit. Again, I think each of the markets in EVs is somewhat unique. So I think if we start in the U.S., I mean, I think clearly in the U.S., as much as sort of the natural dialectic of the industry is to get more and more affordable. We just have not seen the signs that there's really much demand or market for affordable EVs here, unfortunately. Again, I think the Chevy Bolt, it was a well-received car, not perfect by any stretch, but and it's kind of disappointed. And the Nissan Leaf was a massive flop in the US. And so what we see instead is that both the newer startups and the legacy companies are really focusing on cars that kind of go more directly against Tesla in that premium class. And I think, I was able to spend about a week with the Ford Mustang Mach-E. And I have to say, I think for most people, that is everything you would want in a Tesla, with some of the advantages of, a dealer that you can have a relationship with, a manufacturer that frankly, has a better record on quality and manufacturing and service. And so, it may not have, all the bells and whistles of a Tesla. It may not be quite as fast or what have you, but I think that people are willing to ultimately make some sacrifices on those things where Tesla just completely stands out from the pack, in order to have some of those basic, sort of ownership experience comforts. I think especially people who have had some experience with Tesla oftentimes find themselves in that place. And so I think you see And I think, companies, newer startups like Rivian and Lucid, in my conversations with people who work there, it's clear to me that sort of the lesson that I talk about in the book, that really the future, it does not so much belong just to people who copy Tesla, but really, I think people who sort of chart a middle course between sort of Tesla's radical, Silicon Valley startup type approach and the more traditional industrial legacy approach. It's in that middle ground. It's figuring out how to make those two approaches work together. That's really where the real interesting progress is going to be made, because ultimately you need both. You need to surprise and delight and keep current with modern technologies, but you also have to provide people that car ownership experience that they're used to, which does include a level of robustness and reliability and the ability to get service and a whole bunch of other factors. And I think that at this point, the legacy, I mean, as far as I'm concerned with the Mach-E, the legacy automakers have shown it's more than possible for them to do this. What Tesla can do with its vehicles, it can stay a little bit ahead on the margins, again, on certain things, 0 to 60 time and maybe things like that. But again, when you talk about getting to 85% of that or whatever, 90% of that, and then offering more in terms of sort of that solid ownership experience factors. The legacy folks are there. They're not doing it at major scale yet, but I think vehicles like the F-150 Lightning is going to be real big challenge there. And then you have companies like Rivian and Lucid that are bringing, attacking that same sort of premium space, that, vehicle that reflects who you are as a person, and bringing whole new dimensions to it. Rivian with that kind of outdoorsy lifestyle vehicle type of thing, which from all the reports that I'm hearing from the people who've been driving those, they've really executed that perfectly. Lucid, you hear really good things about as well, and it's challenging Tesla on things like range and efficiency, drivetrain efficiency, and trying to hold themselves up as the standard bearers for EV drivetrain advancements. And so all these together, present real challenges. But I think the real, big challenges are also in Europe, where you have Volkswagen. I think they've had some struggles, but I think that's to be expected. Car industries, this is one of the main differences between Tesla, is Tesla sort of front loads the good impressions and sort of, pushes the problems off to the long tail. And the auto industry does the opposite kind of. They prefer to kind of go through that tough, learning phase and then try and get to that smooth operating phase quickly. And Volkswagen, maybe that some of the adjustments have been a little bit more challenging, but I think, they're an industrial machine. And I think, if they continue to stick with their vision, they're going to be really impressive. I think the company, though, that is most interesting to kind of contrast directly to Tesla is actually BYD. And a few years ago, they were still not getting the recognition they deserve. But I think BYD now, you have to recognize that when it comes to sort of both doing the Tesla thing, but then also sort of incorporating some of the industry, practices around just standardizing and making things modular and platforms. And critically, one critical thing that BYD really differentiates from Tesla is its ability to work with other automakers, which is so critical to scale. Tesla had partnerships with Toyota and Daimler at once upon a time, which are two of the most respected automakers in the world, hands down. And those relationships did not go well. And the word is out sort of inside Tesla, both within, the OEMs in terms of partnerships, but then also suppliers in terms of supplier relationships. Tesla is a very difficult company to work for. It's kind of all about them all the time, and their needs sort of very much come first, and they're not necessarily looking for win-wins in their partnerships. So that word is out, and I think that really becomes a big challenge, especially when Tesla is going to need to draw on expertise that, and resources that suppliers have, that other OEMs have. And you see BYD doing this, right? I mean, you see BYD supplying batteries to the Mach-E that's being built in China. Now they're partnering with Nuro in the AV space to put batteries into their delivery bots, bunch of companies. And I think that, Tesla, looking back, that lack of ability to partner and to make partnerships, and to win-win relationships long-term is going to be one of the big challenges for Tesla.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, maybe we could shift gears to autonomous vehicles now. So we've covered electric vehicles and the transition and the competitors and everyone that's involved in there. But Tesla also has this move towards autonomy, that trying to be the first mover in the autonomy space with its autopilot feature, and it has a very different approach from a Google tries to come from. So, but before we get into Tesla's approach versus Google's and maybe other players' approach, maybe we could talk about autonomy and autonomous vehicles more generally. So you've mentioned before that autonomy is the real revolution in the industry right now. So like electric vehicles is an evolution. It's good, but autonomy is more revolutionary. Why is that? Why is autonomy so important and so revolutionary?
Yeah. So, in my work as at Partners for Automated Vehicle Education, which, by the way, these are all my personal views here. I couldn't represent the more than 80 companies that make up our coalition if I wanted to, but I've been doing a lot of work to kind of peel away the layers of the onion in terms of like how do we explain this technology in a way where that makes sense to people, so you can start to think about for yourself what it looks like. And I think the sort of core of building the right mental model around this technology is to not start with thinking of them as cars. Like I think a lot of people tend to think of, and clearly, if you look at Tesla's approach to this technology, this is where they're starting. Is okay, you have a car, and we all know what a car is, or we all have our mental model of a car, and it's really as a generalized utility, mobility device, right? So it go anywhere, do anything. It's not really tied to the road it's on. It can kind of go anywhere, and in any conditions. And rather than starting from the car to think about an autonomous vehicle and what their place in our world is going to be, you have to start with a robot, because that's really what they are. So on one level, I mean, these are just literally robotic systems, but also, a robot, if you ask someone to draw a car, they'll draw a car. You ask someone to draw a robot, what they're going to draw could vary a lot. And I think that's the important piece of this. A robot, as you know from our visits to car factories, it's designed to do a specific task, right? And so if you have a welding robot, it's going to look a certain way. If you have a lifting robot, it's going to be big and heavy and be able to lift lots of weight. So if you're putting on a screw, that's something different. So robots, fundamentally, the design of a robot depends entirely on the task being filled. And I think we've come to think a lot about autonomy as like one singular problem that like a company will solve and then everything will be autonomous. And in reality, autonomy and its viability, especially at this point, is very dependent on what is the task being done and what is the domain in which it's being done. And those things, don't just determine how sort of both technically and economically viable an AV can be, but it also literally determines what it even looks like. And so you see already sort of hints at this diversity that AVs are going to give rise to when you see something like the Cruise Origin or the Zoox Robotaxi, which is these boxes on wheels, which even look quite different between the two of them, even though they're both kind of boxes on wheels. But then you have the Neuro, R2 delivery bot, which is tiny little thing, and but still technically a car, right? It's not on the sidewalks. It drives like a car, but it's much smaller. You have Volvo truck concepts that don't have a cab. It's just a flat thing on four wheels that a trailer hooks onto, and it drives around. And so I think that's when you're thinking about this technology, you have to think about diversity. You can't, I don't think, can get locked into the sort of car monoculture that we've all grown up with, and because that's sort of the water that we swim in, so to speak. It's actually quite hard to think about this technology in a way that's not overly shaped by cars, because that's not what this is. This technology is it's mobility robotics, and you kind of have to start there to really think about it properly.
Perfect. And automated vehicles change lots of things. So we're even questioning like a question that comes around often is if autonomous vehicles are finally the technological leap that we had to take in order to avoid car ownership altogether. So like people have, at least in more dense cities and in countries like in countries in Europe or more denser than the US, you have people already abdicating car ownership in favor of Uber and the other practical things. that have shown as alternatives. But more and more, if we think about autonomous vehicles at all, so like everything autonomous and transportation as an autonomous system that's independent of an ownership of anything, where maybe autonomous vehicles is the leap towards migrating from car ownership to ride hailing at all, right? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's certainly one of the big possibilities. I think ride hailing had a lot of hype around it, and it's had quite a bit of success in terms of scaling and certainly winning mind share and things like that. But there are some really fundamental challenges to it, and I think particularly when you start to see like labor market conditions changing, companies like Uber, their fates can vary wildly. And I think that that's one of the things that's really driving a lot of interest in automation. But I think also, it's easy to focus too much on the personal mobility application as well sometimes with this. And I think that especially when you realize that vehicles and robotics and all of these hardware really require so much scale, and you start to think about this technology more abstractly, and you realize, well, actually, a lot of the opportunities in the shorter term are not in personal mobility. And in fact, people always ask, so when will AVs be here? When will they be economically viable? And the reality is that AVs have been economically viable in specific use cases, like for example, mining trucks hauling ore from faraway mines in Australia. AVs have been doing this for a decade almost. And it's a combination of what is the job to be done and what is the domain in which it needs to be done, and that's one where those factors coincide. And so I think we've seen this sort of whole hype phase around AVs that's been very much sort of around we're going to revolutionize the way you get around and that personal mobility application, and sort of developing a platform that will solve all kinds of autonomy problems. And I think that will continue. I think it's already been slower than people thought, and I think that it will continue to be scaling that and validating that, and will continue to be a challenge, in large part just because even just anything consumer facing is going to be really, really tricky. But this is also why you see companies like Waymo and Aurora and countless others diversifying also into trucking, right? And because there you have an application where the domain is mostly just on the freeway. They're finding routes where it's one warehouse to one warehouse. You have no consumer interaction, because you talk about driving edge cases in autonomy, but there's all these customer service edge cases as well, that I think is one of the reasons that it's been challenging for a Waymo to scale there. Even though they have a driverless ride hailing service in Phoenix, they're still learning a lot about the edge cases around just dealing with human customers in addition to human drivers. And I think that's really widely underappreciated. So again, finding those applications where you can sort of get the technology that you have today out, in a domain where it can operate safely, validating it and getting it, proving that it can be economically viable, and then finding more of those is going to be the way to do it. And I think we're already seeing you have to be open-minded to do that. You can't just say we're a company that only does personal mobility. You have to be open to those trucking applications, maybe those agriculture applications, maybe mining, a lot of different things. And in fact, we're seeing even now a new wave of sort of autonomous vehicle, smaller startups that, quite unlike the Cruises and the Waymos and the what have you, they're not trying to, some would say, boil the ocean, right? Create a platform that can solve autonomy in major cities like around the world. But instead, they're super focused on very short-term applications for this technology in those fields like trucking or in even more smaller and more focused in agriculture and mining and resource extraction and things of that nature. And I think that that's going to be where a lot of the interesting and exciting stuff happens in the short run. And in the long run, it's this AV technology as a sort of more general purpose tool that will get you anywhere you want in a city. That is something that will continue to, I think, take more time than a lot of people had kind of hoped.
Yeah, great. Well, it makes perfect sense. And then if we could, so you mentioned Waymo, you mentioned Cruise. So Waymo's the Google-owned company for autonomous vehicles. And then we know that their approach towards autonomous vehicles is different from Tesla's approach. So Tesla's been promoting their autonomy features for a long time now. So Autopilot's been there for a while now, and but they approach the problem from a fundamentally different angle. So with different hardware from their competitors, and betting on a different approach. Could you talk about these different approaches that companies have towards autonomy, and what's your opinion on strengths and weaknesses from both sides?
Yeah, I mean, I think Tesla. I don't think it's fair to really almost even mention them in the same category. I think Tesla, they were this big, very exciting, very cutting edge company. They had a deal with Google, or nearly a deal in Google in 2013 to buy the company because they'd run into problems again. And I think they saw in those discussions that Google's technology was a lot further along. And I think very clearly, if you look at the history, Tesla, Elon Musk, they realized like, we're going to be left behind here. We have to kind of stay ahead. And I think, unfortunately, Tesla as an automaker, there's a lot of good, and there's some, concerns and challenges. Unfortunately, I think Tesla's approach to this driving automation technology has just been all bad. Frankly, I think it's all been an effort to create an impression that they're a player in this technology, when in fact they aren't particularly. Everything they have on the road is a level 2 driver assistance system. They started with the constraints of their car business and tried to graft autonomy onto that, and that's intrinsically a bad fit. And as witnessed by the fact that the kind of benefits that they end up hyping are like, well, your car is going to be an appreciating asset, which is absolutely no evidence that that's actually going to, that has been the case, or that will be the case. We've had 5 years now of Elon Musk saying, full self-driving is right around the corner. Pay us to $10,000. You'll get it any day now. I frankly don't see, and again, we could get into all the technical details of what camera only means, and why, self-driving is not just an AI problem, it's a systems engineering problem. And this is why you have, it's not like every other company in the space, including, ones run by the guys who invented modern AV stacks in DARPA. Like, they don't use LiDAR because they like having their systems be more expensive. They don't make their systems as complex and expensive as they are because they think that's a good way to go to business. They're doing it because that's what you need to solve the problem, and that's what you need to do it safely. And I think if you talk about Tesla's ticking risk bombs, I think none of them are bigger than, first of all, the regulatory risks around Autopilot as a level 2 system, because it lacks operational design domain limits and driver monitoring. There's this real strong tendency for the human to become complacent, inattentive. This is when crashes happen. Our NTSB in the US has investigated several of these crashes and concluded that the system is designed in a way that encourages this. So I think there could easily be a recall there, and their investigation's ongoing. And then on the full self-driving side, I think, frankly, there's just a growing awareness that it's a scam. And I know that's strong language, and I know that people will say, oh, he's just a Tesla hater, but how people can go for 5 years. Elon Musk called this a solved problem in 2016 when he started taking money for this, and has said it's 12 to 18 months away ever since. Where's the beef, right? Like, where's the evidence? I think they've released one video. You go look at a Zoox, for example, and their YouTube page is just full of video of all kinds of really complex, things that their systems are doing. And so I see Tesla's entire involvement with driving automation to be a major risk bomb for them. And I think that taking is absolutely getting louder on that. I think, as someone who works in AV education, the fact that this has, been able to be taken as seriously as it has, when it's so fundamentally different from what literally everyone else in the industry is doing in terms of, mapping, like setting an operating domain, systems engineering around the AI, so that you're not having to have probabilistic inferences happen with 99.999% reliability, which has never been demonstrated before. Getting to those levels of reliability require a more deterministic system architected around that probabilistic inference. And again, Tesla can't even engage on those levels of sophistication. It's really just the strength of its approach is that people can hear the story. It's a satisfying story, like everything Tesla says. They nod and they smile and they say, "Oh yes, it's more data. They're going to win." And it just simply is a shot through with misperceptions and misunderstandings. So But on the other hand, I think also, part of Tesla's doing that has been blurring the line between what is driver assistance that requires a human in the loop and what is actually self-driving. And that too creates all kinds of problems, not just contributing to these crashes, contributing to the misreporting of these crashes. And I think, what you're seeing from folks in the industry, and I think increasingly from regulators in the US, is that there's an understanding that these misunderstandings that Tesla is engendering in order to sort of create this perception are actually putting public acceptance of this technology at risk. And I think that's something that people in the AV space have really come to appreciate over the last few years, is that this is a technology unlike any other because it depends on people trusting their lives to it. And this was really hammered home for me when I took my first fully driverless Waymo ride. There's something about when there's no human there ready to take over, you realize you're trusting this company and their technology, and you ask yourself, why, and should I? And I think that Tesla is playing fast and loose with that public trust. And I think everyone else in the industry is being very conservative. That's one of the main reasons why this is all taking so much longer than everyone else. And I think that in the long run, that slow and steady, approach of not endangering public acceptance is the only way. Because once you lose public trust, how do you get people into your vehicles? And then how do you have a business if you can't get people into your vehicles? And I think that Tesla's already done so much to hurt that public trust that when sort of the consequences start to catch up to them, they're going to be in a very indefensible position.
Yeah, super interesting. And one thing that I keep going forward and backwards in your speech is that you said about the job to be done. And it's a very different approach, right? When you get autopilot and you can turn it on anywhere versus the approach that Waymo took in Phoenix that said, hey, let me map this area before, and let me have a specific region where this works. And if I have that really well mapped, and if I have more hardware, and if I have radars and lidars and everything that helps me understand the environment, I'll lower the risk a lot, and I'll do this in a safe way instead of trying to push it before it's ready. Well, thank you so much for the talk. It's been super thoughtful, super interesting, and your insights will help us a lot and keep helping us a lot to understand the industry. And I hope we have the opportunity to have more talks like this in the future.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure for me. Thank you so much for having me.